This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 24 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, Wanderlust for adults who didn't travel as kids. Now, when you listen to this episode, I'll have just come back from a trip to the Gold Coast in Australia, on the east coast of Australia. I'm headed over there shortly after recording this for a few days of blogging madness at the Pro Blogger Conference. Now, the Gold Coast is not my all-time favourite travel destination, but because of my terrible wanderlust, pretty much anywhere I get to go where I get to go on a plane and be somewhere new and different from home is always a great trip. And this one will be extra great because I'll get to catch up with a lot of my blogging friends. I have a big travel bloggers dinner on the first night I'm there, if I've got my schedule right in my head. And I'll also be able to meet up with a lot of the other podcasters from the Jackrabbit FM network, which brings me to this point. I don't know if any of you listen to some of the other podcasts. I certainly listen to most of them regularly. They take up all my walking time, which is great. And they're talking about podcasts like the Slow Hum podcast or Let It Be or Straight and Curly, among others. And anyway, the Thoughtful Travel podcast also belongs to the Jackrabbit FM network, and they are holding the first Jackrabbit FM listener survey. So if you have a second, or in fact about 2 or 3 minutes, I just took the survey myself, and I think a couple of minutes is all you need to complete just a quick online survey. That will help Jackrabbit FM to improve all of the shows that we're already running and get a good idea of what our listeners love, and help make your listening experience even better. So the survey is at jackrabbit.fm/survey. I'll put a link in the show notes as well, but it's jackrabbit.fm survey, and that would be fabulous if you could help us out by filling that in. So on to today's topic about wanderlust for adults who didn't travel as kids. And this is a topic I never really expected to be able to talk about because I grew up travelling. Not a lot, but certainly we did some really significant trips, like 6 months in Europe on a really budget kind of trip when I was 9 years old. So I was always sure that my wanderlust came from the travels I experienced as a kid. But when I look at my sister who experienced the same travelling, she travels now and again, but she certainly has nothing of the insistent passion for it that I do, which means she has a bit more income left over than I do. But in any case, today I'm talking to 3 different people who have all quite severe cases of wanderlust these days as adults, but they didn't really have much experience of travelling as a kid. And I think that's an interesting perspective to ponder. So my first guest today is Lisa Luken of Simple Joy Living, and she just grew up on a farm surrounded by the cornfields and didn't really travel at all. And I'll let her tell you about where her wanderlust then came from.
Well, I grew up on a farm in the middle of the United States in Illinois, and I lived a very sheltered life and didn't really see much of the world, really just the cornfields around me, and my immediate family was close. So when we traveled to Wisconsin, just straight north for about a 5-hour drive, and that was the extent of my travels pretty much growing up. And when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to go to Germany and loved that and couldn't believe this whole other world over there. It was so different than what I was used to. And the history and how old it was. And granted, I was in high school, so I didn't go into it with quite the same aspect I would now as an adult. But still, I learned a lot, and just it really opened my eyes up to this big world around us. And then as I continued to kind of grow into my adulthood, did all the college, all the things I was supposed to do, got married, had kids and all that, we actually had come to a point in our life where we had accumulated too much stuff and life had become somewhat unfulfilling. And so as we did a lot of work kind of as ourselves, or inner work for ourselves, and then with our family, and started really looking at what we wanted with our life, I thought, I started to see this new perspective of where if we didn't have all this stuff to hold us back and the jobs that we needed to support all this stuff, our life could be a lot simpler, number one. and that could free us up to travel. So that's where kind of in this whole kind of looking at life, thinking about what I really wanted to be doing, because I had always, during work, I had wished for the weekend. And then during the weekends, I couldn't wait till we could go on vacation somewhere. And then the vacation would come and then it would be over in a week and we'd be back at our day to day. So I couldn't handle that life anymore. So I just wanted to be able to travel more. So we made the changes to make it happen. And in the past 3 years, we've really done a lot. I'm just so grateful for it, because it's just been such an eye opener to kind of have that period where I had that glimpse many years ago, and then now be able to actually go and see even more than that. So it's really been fun.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Just a few years ago, when you decided to travel, a lot more with your family, what made you really feel that was the right thing to do? If you didn't have that much experience of it, and traveling with 3 kids is not easy either. What made you sure that it was the thing that was going to be right for you guys?
I just felt this need to get out and live my life and see the world. And I didn't really know any different from I always called it my 5-mile radius, that I could do everything I needed to do in my life. Yeah. And we lived near Chicago. So, and I had to work in Chicago sometimes, but I never looked at that as a traveling experience. And so I didn't really have a lot of experience with that. And so I just felt this need to get out and see the world. And then, as my kids started asking questions about, what's this, and learning about things in school, I thought, what better way to learn than to actually go and see all these things. So I should mention, we have a dog too, a 13-pound dog that has made he's gone to all the states with us except one, which we flew to. So he's been with us too, but it's just been so much fun to teach them about the world and the history around them and let them see it, because I think it relates so much more with them. They're not just reading about it in a book or even looking at things online nowadays. They're actually in the middle of it, and they have such a greater perspective of it because of that.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah. And it's not just true of children, but adults too. Immersing yourself in it just makes such a bigger impact than reading about it or watching it on TV or anything. That's absolutely true. Can I just zoom you back to your high school trip to Germany? What were the most impressive things for you there? What made you think then, all these years later, traveling is something for me? What was it that was most exciting about it for you?
I think that it had such a rich history, that it was so old. I mean, the United States, I guess, isn't young either, but it's just so different. Cities were built much more recently and just a completely different style. And I just, the cobblestone streets and the tiny streets. I remember being on this giant tour bus and traveling down these streets, and I could believe that this was a real town and that things were really this old in other parts of the world. And the culture too, the accent. I was learning German in school, and so that's why I was with the German class. So getting to hear the language firsthand was really awesome. There was just so much. We did quite a few. We went to Austria too on that trip, and just getting to see some historical places. This was before the Berlin Wall fell, but we still got to see quite a few historical places, and to put that all in perspective was just such a eye-opening experience. A few years later, well, I guess not a few years later, after I was married, my husband surprised me with a trip to England too. So that was probably it's about 10 years ago. And so so well before we've done our major travel right now, but that also kind of reminded me, oh yeah, there's this whole other world across the pond. And then even beyond that.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
haven't been to yet, but.
Yeah. Oh, there is so much to see. Exactly. Oh, no, it's really interesting. Because in fact, I have a bit of a parallel experience to you. So my first really significant travel was age 9, when my parents took me around Europe in a motorhome for 6 months. But I was quite, I was 9, so I was young. But as a teenager, 14, 15, I also went to Germany for a high school trip, because I also learnt German in school. Cool. And I know that was quite a different experience. And the same thing, that's when I really appreciated, the old buildings and the history and the language, because by then I could speak a little, not much, but, something, so I could recognise some of the things that were happening around me. And I think because I was travelling not with my parents as well, then that did make made a difference to, how I perceived everything. So, yeah, and that was definitely instrumental in cementing the fact that I knew I just had to keep travelling. I thought it was so funny that Lisa and I had such a similar experience, both being able to spend time in Germany when we were in high school. And I completely relate to the feeling that she would have got from that. I know I came home from that trip dying to go again and absolutely desperate to travel alone, or without my family, I suppose, again and again. And I've been doing that ever since, I suppose. Our next guest today is Audrey Wanders. Now, I wish that Wanders was her real surname, because Audrey Wanders is a super cool name. But in fact, it's a pen name. She's a school teacher in the US. And when she started blogging, she didn't want all her kids to be able to Google and find her blog necessarily. Not that there's anything, offbeat about it, but I guess a teacher doesn't want every secret they write about exposed to their kids. So she writes Audrey Wanders about all kinds of areas, including sort of simple living stuff and impact on the world, and also about significant travel experiences she's had, like a road trip recently. But today, Audrey speaks with us about where her wanderlust started, although she didn't travel as a kid.
My father grew up in a military family. So he, what we call an army brat, he moved from place to place all the time, he and his 4 siblings and his parents. And then when my grandfather retired, he was still moving. It was kind of like he couldn't sit still either. He was a professional musician and he traveled around, 40 plus states. And he actually met my mom on the road. He was playing a gig in Ohio and they met. And soon after they met, he convinced her to quit her job, sell her car, pack up her apartment and move on the road with him. And so, they were still traveling and got married in New Mexico while they were on the road. The only witnesses at the wedding were the people in the band. And so they finally settled after my mom became pregnant with my oldest sister. And so I really feel like just that constant movement was somehow passed down genetically. I don't know if that's a thing, but I think that's what started it. And it's interesting because even though that was a really big part of my parents' lives, it wasn't after they started having kids. So there was a point when I was in college where I realized that I could count the number of states I had been to on one hand. And that just felt really weird to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not that I didn't have a great childhood and I didn't have good experiences. It just felt so strange to me, that realization that I hadn't actually visited very many places.
Did you grow up with your parents telling you the stories of when they'd been on the road and stuff?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right, yeah, so that was really a part of your childhood memories, but you didn't act it out. It just was stories that you heard.
Right. Uh-huh. And we would travel a little bit as a family on vacation and stuff, but of course it was nothing like being a musician on the road, bumming around. So that was always big for me. And I started playing music when I was very young, so that whole wandering vagabond troubadour thing was very much a dream of mine. I haven't actually gone on my silly coffee shop tour that I wanted to, but it's definitely part of me, and I kind of have to enact that in some way at some point in my life. So that'll be a fun trip to plan.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Do you have just the one sister or other siblings as well?
I actually have 2 older sisters and 2 older half brothers.
Right. And did they also get this genetic wanderlust, or?
Not as much. I had a lot of my siblings, or a couple of my siblings, had a lot of issues with mental health issues, and it just there were things that kind of took over that I don't know if they would have had that wanderlust, and I'm not sure if they do now, but it's more kind of taking care of themselves. That's their main focus.
Yeah, sure. Different priorities.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting that you feel like it could be genetically passed down to you, because I had this theory for sure that it was genetic, and I wrote a blog post about it a few years ago, and I was just convinced that I was, completely a travel addict purely because my parents were that way. And then I interviewed a few other people at the time, for my blog post, who I thought, I just expected everyone to say the same thing. And everyone said completely different things. And I was really shocked.
Interesting.
And some of them, like people who, travel nonstop, full-time travelers, and they were like, no, I didn't travel until I was 25. My parents have, never left their home state and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, right. Well, that's interesting. So,
right.
So that's why I like, this question of where does it come from is really fascinating to me, because there's obviously just not one way that you become interested in travel. There's lots of different paths. It does sound to me like Audrey's wanderlust has been passed down genetically from her wandering parents, even though I have come to learn that this is not always the case, that parents who love travel do not necessarily produce children who love travel and vice versa. But it's interesting to hear about. My next guest today is Mark Wild from Wild Family Travel. Mark's a fellow Aussie, and he lives with his wife and 2 daughters in a small country town in Victoria. And he didn't travel much as a kid either, but he has certainly made up for it since then.
I'm not sure. I've always wanted to travel. Like, I don't really know why. Because we lived in such a small town. Like, the one thing I always said growing up is, I want to move out of this town because it's so small,
I said the
and I
same
want to
growing up in
see.
Perth.
Yeah, and I want to see more things, and I've never moved out of this town, so I'm still here. And I don't really know why. As a kid, we never really travelled. Like most families, we had a place we went over the summer for a 3-week holiday, which was a coastal town called Lakes Entrance, which was about 100 kilometres from here. And, we used to go there for 3 weeks every year for at Christmas time. And that was about the extent of it. I'd even to such, I've never been to Perth, so
okay,
I've probably travelled more in Europe than I have in Australia. But yeah, I just always thought that there's a big wide world out there, and I like I said, I like history and I like old things. That sort of thing really appeals to me, and so Europe always just seemed to be the place where I should be going.
I totally get that.
And so I did. And that was it. And ever since the first time I went, obviously, you only have to go once, and you're fairly well hooked. So.
Yes, and there's so much to do and see there. Like there's
that's it.
Yeah, endless. You could spend your whole life there.
Oh, for sure, and you go through different, I guess, stages of your life where, I went a couple of times in 3 years at, the start of the century. That sounds old again, but, then I got married and we had some kids and, I had a job that wasn't as well paying as what I have now. So now that we're in a better financial position to be able to travel, hence, in the last 3 years, we've been to Europe 3 times, so when the money's good and you can do it, I say do it, because there'll be times, depending on what you do, where the money's not so good that you're making, and there'll be other priorities that you've got to tackle. Worse luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so how old were you when you first went? Then were you kind of teenage backpacker, or? I
was early 20s.
Right.
So.
And did you go on your own, or what did you do for your first?
Yeah, no, I did go on my own. I had a cousin in England, so I went there and I went on a Contiki, which was great to go on a Contiki because it showed me that I'd never ever go on an organised tour again after my bike. I mean, it was good, but the fact that you sit on a bus, and the same with, I guess, all tours, sitting on a bus for 8 hours a day was certainly not my thing.
No, it wouldn't be mine either.
So I've never been on another organised tour since then. I've always organised everything myself since then. So yeah, I'm not quite in the grey rinse set yet, where I have to start going on bus tours again quite yet. So it's like when people say, "Have you been on a cruise?" and I just say, "I'm not old enough for that just yet." But
that's what I think. I think if I get to the stage where I don't walk very well, then that's time.
Yeah, that's it. I'm sure cruises are lovely, but
I'm sure they have their benefits. I really like to be totally in control of where I go when.
That's it. I like to hit the ground walking, and I like to get out and go all day. So I don't want anyone else to be in control of what I'm seeing and doing, except for my wife, of course. But yeah, the whole Contiki thing sort of put me off. It's great for people who maybe have no plans to travel again, I guess. Probably gives you a really good overview and things like that to us as such of just the main sites. But yeah, the fact that you waste so much time sitting on a bus and on Contiki, you were always hungover because there was always a bar at each destination. destination they had. So, it was very unglamorous.
I can imagine. I never did a Kontiki, but I, fairly quickly worked out that was not going to be my thing.
Yeah, so never been my thing since.
Yeah, fair enough. Live and learn.
Yeah, definitely.
Mark said that he's seen probably much, much more of Europe than he has of his own country, Australia. But to be fair, I think a lot of Australians can say that. Australia is a really big, empty country, and it's relatively difficult and time-consuming to travel around to see, not quite as much. Whereas you pop over to Europe, although it takes a long time to get there from here, but once you're there, you can drive for a couple of hours and be in 2 or 3 different countries. That's unfathomable to us when we've grown up in Australia. And to find all of that culture and history jam-packed into such a small area is pretty amazing. So I don't blame you, Mark. And I'm also really impressed at the effort Mark is going to pass on his wanderlust to his daughters. I think with all the travel experiences that they've already had, and I'm sure Mark and his wife have plenty more planned for them in the future, then I think they will grow up with a very severe case of wanderlust. I don't think it's something you can turn off once you've had so much fun and learnt so much from travelling extensively. I think it's sort of something that's stuck with you. You can't just say, I never want to travel again. Well, I don't think so. I certainly couldn't. So thank you very much for listening to episode 24 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I just want to run through a few places that you can find our guests and some other interesting links. So for a start, Lisa Luken, who I spoke with first, you can find her at Simple Joy Living, which is simply simplejoyliving.com. Followed up with Audrey Wanders, and also at the very logical audreywanders.com. Both of their sites are really worth having a read around and worth spending some time there. And Mark Wild blogs at Wild Family Travel, Wild spelt with a Y, so WYLD. And he's at wildfamilytravel.com. Lots of great destination posts there, and if you're interested in travelling with kids especially, then some really useful information there. In the show notes, I'm also going to put a link to one of my old blog posts about travel genetics, how your parents influence your love of travel. This is one I wrote a couple of years ago when I was so sure that I only love travelling because my parents loved travelling and they had taken me travelling. And that's when I first got to learn that actually there's a whole variety of ways that we earn our wanderlust. So worth a look back on there. And some of the people I interviewed in that post have since been featured on the Thoughtful Travel podcast as well. I'll also leave a link to the Jackrabbit FM listener survey so that if you have a couple of moments, you can hop over there and hop, like a rabbit, and leave us some feedback to help improve the podcasts you love listening to. So it's at jackrabbit.fm/survey. And all of this stuff and more will be in the show notes, and the show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/24. As always, I will be forever indebted to you if you hop over to iTunes and leave a rating or a review. And I would love to hear your thoughts on Wanderlust or anything else travel related. You can reach me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall, use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod, and if you prefer on Facebook, you can search for Not a Ballerina and you'll find me there. Thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, Podcast.